Director David Acosta, I think, item number 7.
No, item number 8, Mr. Chairman.
Item number 8, just as I said. Number 8.
Okay, Chairman Crosby, Commissioners, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
David.
Before you, in your package, there are 5 memorandums dated October 3rd, 2013, which lists recommendations from licensing with respect to 5 questions. We're hoping that we can get some direction from the Commission so that the legal department and licensing can commence drafting regulations as it pertains to licensing. The first memorandum talks about application originating through the gaming establishment versus individuals having the ability or requiring that individuals file the applications and not originating from gaming establishment. I have had experience with both methods of submission. I am recommending that applications originate from the gaming establishment. One of my arguments for that is that in New Jersey we had applications filed directly by individuals and not through gaming establishment, and one thing that we found was that individuals will invest time, effort, and money to file an application only to be told that they are unemployable. We often found individuals requesting for refunds of application because they're unable to find a job. Having an application originate from the gaming establishment at least gives the appearance, at a minimum, that a job has been promised. In addition to that, there could be a mechanism in place where the individual can offset the cost of the application through an agreement with the gaming establishment through payroll deduction, because a person may not have the initial fees for a gaming application. I also indicated in the argument that by having the individual go through the gaming establishment, that is an initial vetting level that is incorporated into the process, eliminating, or not eliminating, but minimizing the number of individuals that would submit an application and for lack of understanding of what the requirements are with respect to suitability, they have no opportunity of getting a license. Your guidance in this particular issue would help us to formulate how the regulation should read with respect to the filing of an application.
Jill, could you come up?
Director, I certainly think we want to, we certainly want to rely on your expertise. This makes perfect sense to me, but you did mention on page 3 an exception. And I was wondering, which also made sense, that there is a mechanism if someone did want to, but what did you have in mind for an exception, which, as you say, should not be the norm? What were you referring to? Give me an example.
There are individuals who wish to file an application. Information on the application may be required by the commission, but it's not information that the individual wants to share with the employer. For the application to originate through the gaming establishment, it in essence give the gaming establishment all information that's required on the application. In New Jersey, there were a number of individuals who did not want to disclose, for whatever particular reason, all of the information that was required to be disclosed in part of the application, and they just did not want to do that. We did have a process in which the gaming establishment will give them a letter, and we're referring to registration. Back in those days, they were referred to hotel registrations, where they will get a letter indicating, I have promised this person a job, but he has indicated that he wishes to apply directly through the commission, and they were okay with that. I don't know if the letter from the casino would necessarily be part of this process. It is in New Jersey. But to allow an individual to file the application on their own, at least the process is there if there is reasons to do that.
Was there an exception in Ohio?
No, in Ohio it was strictly
Through the applicant?
And the reason, one of the main reasons.
Through the gaming establishment.
What's that?
Through the gaming establishment.
Yes.
Okay.
But the statute in Ohio specifically stated that the gaming establishment would be billed for the application fee. So it was clear there that we would bill them directly, and there was no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
Other states like Maryland also initiate an application via a gaming establishment. So it's a practice that's common in a number of other states.
How do you, if you do it, your recommendation makes great sense to me as well, but how do you ensure that you're going to deal with a focus on hiring local people as opposed to out-of-state people? Or let me put it another way. Do you know if either way is more conducive to getting local people licensed than it is, than the other way is?
My experience in both states have found that neither system really encourages local employment. In New Jersey, for a number of years, it was required by statute that the applicant be a New Jersey resident, and there was language to say that you must provide verification that you were a New Jersey resident. For example, a copy of a voter registration or a driver's license.
Right.
That requirement did go away. In Ohio, that didn't happen. In the casinos that bordered other states, for example, in Toledo, where it bordered Michigan, there were a significant number of individuals who applied from the state of Michigan. They were probably closer to the casino than other residents of Ohio. The same thing occurred in Cincinnati. However, the dynamics in Cleveland and in Columbus was that it was primarily local individuals, because it's expensive to relocate, and the commute would be, cost prohibitive. So,
Right, okay.
I'd like to expand on that, because I had the same thought, that I agree with others who have said this looks like it's the most efficient system. I can see what the advantages of it are, but it starts all of a sudden to get right to the heart of issues of local hiring, diversity, hard to employ groups. The casino is going to have a premium, is going to put a premium on efficiency, on speed, to some extent, as we've heard, about upward mobility for their own people. They're going to be under certain constraints, their HCA constraints and whatever conditions are on our license, but they aren't going to have the same interest that we have and that the Commonwealth has in local, diverse, and so forth. So what we do is create a bottleneck, which easily could be a bottleneck for, well, let's say it could be easily used as a way to facilitate the casinos fast tracking the people that they were interested in getting. So if we're going to do this, first of all, I'd like to have your folks, advisory folks, think about this, and is this an issue? And we need to make sure that these regs are reviewed by people who bring the perspectives to the table that some of your advisory groups do. But if we go down this route, we need to make sure that we've written regs about it in a way that don't run counter to our other important public policy objectives.
One thing I can say is, in reviewing the application, there are a number of questions that are being asked from the potential licensees as to how they're going to address the issue of hiring local individuals. So the commissioners who will be evaluating that particular section can look and see which casino has the best plan. It will be our job after the awarding of the license to gather information, data, to find out if what they presented is being supported by facts. We're in the process of putting together a licensing system, and I've had conversations with other staff in which we're looking at trying to gather information that would enable us to review how in fact the casinos are complying with this. Who are the individuals they're hiring? Where do they come from? You know, what groups are they? Are they groups, are they females? Are they Hispanics? Are they?
Well, I think that's well said, and I agree with that. And as I said, there are other mitigating factors to this, but we just want to make sure that we don't set up an institutional structure which is institutionally built to be countered. We don't want to be constantly running up against an institutional structure which doesn't really facilitate our public policy objectives. So, so we just need to take both of those sides of both of those different public policy interests in mind when we're drafting the regs that will implement this. Do you have any particular perspective on this one way or the other?
No, I'd like to better understand the implications in terms of diversity in local hiring, and as you suggested, Director Acosta and I have been speaking about bringing in workforce development stakeholders and folks who are concerned about diversity to have some of these discussions.
Right. Okay.
It may in fact be, it's interesting, it may in fact be easier to hold people's feet to the fire if you had
True. Good point.
a licensed, vendor-based licensing system, because then you know exactly who they're applying for and can pick up demographic data much
Right.
much more easily.
Right, and who's accountable.
And who's
There can't be
accountable, right.
Okay.
I had a little bit of a different opinion, David, with your recommendation, and certainly understand, I think, in the ramp-up period when we know licensees are looking to hire at a rapid pace, bring people on board, get them trained, regardless of what training they may have already gone through in the first place. And certainly see a window where not clogging up the licensing system with people that are just throwing license applications, but as opposed to let's handle the license applications from people that are, to a degree, and probably a higher degree, guaranteed some form of employment. But I certainly see a period where after these licensees are up and running, that if I'm an individual, I choose to go through a training, I want to position myself for a job at some point, that I should be able to apply for a license regardless of whether I have an offer of a job, but be able to market myself as saying, I have the training, I have the skills, I've been through any number of training programs, and I'm licensed by the Commonwealth. I would think that positions that individual to be a more attractive candidate when an applicant has an opening and wants to hire somebody. So I agreed with the context of the initial hiring process to, again, not clog our system with people who either don't have a job or we may ultimately find unsuitable, but finding a way through our regs to position a process where after the startup period, somebody who chooses to want to pursue this career, as we see in many other occupations, where you go out, you get trained, you get licensed, and then, you know, hopefully that makes you more marketable in applying for a position. I don't know if there's a way to, whether I'm a lone voice on this or not, whether there's a way to kind of allow for that adjustment in the regulatory process. I know you also mentioned talking about, non-gaming vendor registration should originate also through the gaming establishment. Again, I think there's a marketability for a company that wants to be a non-gaming vendor to be able to say, I'm licensed, I've been, reviewed by the Gaming Commission, I can easily supply widgets and gadgets, to you, Mr. Casino licensee. So I just kind of look at your recommendations kind of under two viewpoints, that initial early startup viewpoint and then a ongoing operation of the system, in the months or years years ahead after a license has been awarded.
Just duly noted. Again, I try to answer the question about what are the exceptions. In the exceptions, maybe an example like what you just provided could be part of that. Again, I can only say I hate to be the person to tell an individual who went through training, who got licensed, and for some reason the casinos are looking for somebody who smiles a certain way, and that person cannot smile that certain way, and doesn't find what they're looking for and gets totally frustrated and comes back to us and says, I want my money back, this didn't get me nowheres. What can I do with this?
But to a degree, I think that has a lot to do with not only our responsibility to put out as much information as we can in advance and hopefully direct the public to look at that information, but certainly in our partnership with the community colleges, they think about screening and vetting all these people that, hopefully the system at the bottom of the funnel won't get clogged up with those people who have no chance, as you pointed out the other day over Bunker Hill, have no chance of being found suitable. So, some ability or some responsibility back on our part to put enough information out there that we don't, I hate to keep using the word clog up, but fill our system with people that we're just going to spin our wheels on and ultimately not find suitable for a license. Again, I just don't know how that translates into regulatory language to make the
With respect to vendors, process I'm familiar with in states that have registration, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, you have a product that you want to sell. The vendor registration is just a basic, name, rank, and serial number form that is submitted via a casino. I enter into an agreement, the purchasing department sends it to the licensing department. We then will have an application that's a little bit more in-depth and tell the individual you have so many days to fill this out on the registration. Because it's a registration, that person will then fill out the registration form that's a little bit more in-depth, and we will then start monitoring the level of business that is being conducted by that company. Right. Once they're registered, they can do business with anybody else. They don't have to re-register. I don't know what other way would really be efficient, for lack of a better word, for a non-gaming vendor registrant than going to the casino and saying, look, this is the product I have. It's just a registration versus a license, where a vendor license, obviously, a gaming vendor license, that has to be independent from originating from a casino. That individual who is considered a gaming vendor should submit an application directly to the commission without having to go through a casino. Once they have that license, they can go and negotiate with whatever casino they wish. And again, those individuals, the vetting process is much more significant, it's much more longer, the companies are bigger, they're much more complicated, so they need to apply directly to the commission. But the employees and the registrants, I strongly recommend understand your position, and I'm sure that when the legal department and licensing will get together and try to draft regulations, we'll have some consideration to make those exceptions, in particular to the ones that wish to go and apply, after they've completed a training, keeping in mind the other stakeholders, that being the colleges, the job training programs, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we had another topic that came up in a meeting we had the other day, talking about, small business opportunities are, for folks that are gonna need, financing to be able to build their capacity to be a qualified vendor. And, the brainstorming came back around the idea of, well, if you directly approached an applicant, and the applicant was giving you some sign or guarantee of work, how could, a potential vendor kind of take that, not almost a guarantee of work, and translate it into some type of collateral for financing from any number of lending institutions? But interesting dynamic in terms of how our licensing process may end up helping a small business be able to position itself for more work, or guarantee work, or guarantee the resources that they need to have capacity to make sure they can service that contract. So a little creative thinking on our part, maybe.
I wonder if we could come back to Commissioner Stebbins' thought about the initial ramp-up as opposed to the later licensing for individuals, and simply create now, because you do need to get started on this, a licensing scheme that predominantly focused on casino-based licensing. Take a look and set a deadline internally for looking at what that's produced and hasn't produced over a 18-month period, and then take a second look at how we're doing things. My concern is, although I understand what you're saying, is that the secondary regulatory apparatus that we might have to put in place in order to make that work is something I think we need to take a look at and think about. The educational pieces, the certification pieces, do we need any of those things? Or there's a paper here that we're going to get to in a minute, but we'll have a much better idea of what this thing looks like, who's being excluded, what the experience of the Mass Community College Training Institute is after 18 months to 2 years, say, and then can take another look at how we go about this and have a streamlined thing that gets everybody up and running initially and moves forward.
Okay, you got the gist of that?
Yeah, I'm taking notes on.
Good.
The next question, memorandum, is a question pertaining to the commission's role in the approval of licensure. And that one is one that
Which one is this?
Second.
Mr. Grossman and I have had a number of conversations, as well as other staff. As you probably read in the memorandum, you may want to hopefully join in. There are sections of the act that talk about the IAB's role in the approval, and there's also sections on the act that talks about the commission issuance of a license. My past experience has been that the commission has reviewed and approved all gaming-related vendors, all key and qualifiers, and any recommendation that contains derogatory information. And that is something that I'm hoping is practiced here in Massachusetts and the Commonwealth, but still take into consideration the language that currently exists. I think it is important for the commission to look at who are the policymakers in the gaming world. Who are the CFOs, the CEOs, the head of security, the head of audit. And the commission have an opportunity to view the investigative report to determine whether or not this person has met the standard, the bar that's been established by the Commonwealth. My recommendation is that those individuals be presented before the commission, that a recommendation report be presented to you at a public meeting, and the commission at that point can decide whether or not the issuance of the license is appropriate. With respect to registrants and gaming licenses that do not contain derogatory information, that is the authority of the IEB, and the IEB can grant that license without any further review by the commission.
Director, is it your experience in New Jersey and Ohio that there's an appeal process for someone who may disagree with an IEB licensing decision? My
understanding of the way the statute reads, that if the IEB recommends, if the IEB denies a license, the individual is able to request for a hearing before the IEB, and the IEB has an established procedure on how that's going to take place. If the individual decides that the IEB's decision is not one that they're comfortable with, they can at that time appeal that decision to the commission, and the commission will hear as a whole.
That's reasonable.
Go ahead.
I just pick up on one point just to make sure we're all on the same page, because I think this is an important part of what David is saying. Licensing, as you're probably all aware, is largely governed by Section 30 of Chapter 23K, and a process is set out by law relative to the different types of licensees. This doesn't really touch on vendors, but more the individuals. So there's 3 classes of licenses. You have your key gaming employees, your gaming employees, and the gaming service employees, who don't have to be licensed but only registered. And what the statute does is it talks about, as David was mentioning, the process and the interaction between the IEB and the commission. So we thought, as a preliminary matter, that it's important that everyone's on the same page in its reading of Section 30 and understanding what it says, because a quick read of it would lead you to believe that there may be some inconsistencies. But there is a way, we believe, or at least I believe, I think we believe, to read it harmoniously. That is, to be able to reconcile each of the different sections and ensure that what the IEB is doing is consistent with what then the commission does. And what I think is being suggested is essentially you have to start to understand how the flow of applications would go. In that, and of course we also have to talk about at some point what role the Division of Licensing would have, because the statute doesn't talk about the Division of Licensing, it just talks about the Bureau. Though clearly the way the organization has been set up, the Division of Licensing will play a substantial role in this process. But what the statute talks about, I think a fair reading suggests anyway, is that an application would come in to the commission. The Division of Licensing or the Bureau would vet it, make sure that it meets all of the administrative requirements, perform a full background check, do whatever else it is that is decided that they have to do, and essentially make a recommendation to the commission to either approve or to deny. And to pick up on what Commissioner Cameron was just saying, in the event that the IEB recommends that an application be denied, the statute talks about an appeal process that one could follow. The first appeal would go to the IEB. So the first decision that gets made by the Division of Licensing / Bureau is really an administrative decision on the papers alone. There's no hearing or anything like that, where the Bureau finds that for whatever reason there's a problem with this application, whether it's a conviction or some other matter that would lead one to find an individual unsuitable. The notice goes to the person saying, we find you unsuitable, we can't issue the license. The person has an opportunity to appeal, to get a hearing at the IEB level. A hearing gets conducted. The IEB at that point either affirms its previous decision, saying that there is a problem here, or it reverses it and says, okay, after further consideration, we approve. In the event, in either event at that point, the commission would then likely get involved. In the event that the IEB affirms its decision that an application should be denied, the individual then has a chance by statute to appeal to the commission to have that matter heard. They could bring the issue to you and say, here's the conviction, here's the issue, you should issue me a license anyway. In the event that it's approved, the IEB either approves it in the first instance on the paper or after a hearing. This is really, I think, the key, one of the key policy considerations. After we ensure that we're on the same page as to what the statute says, one of the key considerations is, how does the commission want to handle the approval process? So that is, once the IEB recommends the approval of a license application, what role does the commission want to play? And I think it's important to look at the approval process for each of these three categories of licenses, perhaps separately. The registrations, the gaming employees, and the key gaming employees. And perhaps you'll have a different level of deference to the recommendation of the IEB depending on the class of license we're talking about. And there are different ways to look at it. I have seen in my past experience that assuming for the registration type issue, of course, for starters, if an applicant meets all of the prerequisites, the IEB does their background check, they recommend approval. Perhaps they just come into the commission and they say, here's a list of 100 people who have applied for registration. We did a thorough background check, we recommend approval. And you, as the commission, say, okay, approve. As opposed to perhaps with the key gaming employees, maybe you'll want to look at each one a little more closely, given the position they'll have at the establishment. So that gets down to the approval process, and that's something that I think needs to be fleshed out a little bit, is how are you going to deal with the recommendations for approvals, and what involvement do you want to have in that process? Do you want to just defer essentially to the judgment of the IEB and Division of Licensing, or do you want to have a more active role? What type of proceeding would you want to engage in? And so those are, I believe, the issues that we'll have to wrestle with as we move forward. As a footnote to the conversation, there are, in your existing regulations, provisions for administrative hearings for appeals that have already been set in place. So it's important to reference those as we move forward. But I think, and that doesn't get into the vendors. I haven't actually closely studied the vendor statute yet, but as a preliminary matter, we took a look at Section 30, which deals with this. And those seem to be the issues that we sought your guidance on to make sure that when we start drafting regulations, that we do it in a fashion that you'll find to be consistent with the statute, and as a matter of policy, kind of covers all the bases.
Comments?
I like the thought of being involved on the key, having the report, if you will, on the key employees. I just want to make sure, how would we define, is it defined, is the key employee defined currently, or is that something that we need to define better by regulation?
No, it needs to be defined better by regulation. There is some basic language that talks about a key, but that needs to be defined because there are some, for example, a pit boss in one state is a key because they have discretionary decision. They're able to approve credit for high levels. They're able to approve complimentaries, et cetera. But in some jurisdictions, in Ohio, pit boss is not required to have a key. In other states, a pit boss is required because of those things. So a list of some of the functions that needs to be defined a little further through regulation as to who is a key. I'm recommending, for example, at a minimum, that every shift in the security department is supervised by an individual who holds a key. They have significant authority over the security of a big, big corporation. And who knows what happens on a Friday at 1 o'clock in the morning that requires a supervisor to make some real significant decision. And that person should be vetted and licensed to a very high standard. We need to ensure that.
The answer to the question is, it needs to be, we have to do more work.
Yep.
Yes.
No, but that's, I appreciate those examples. Could you also just help me understand the idea behind this recommendation relative to anybody's whose application contains derogatory information?
An individual may have an application that does not have any arrest information, but owes a significant amount in child support. And there may be an agreement in which this individual, in the state of New Jersey, we used to practice this, and it was actually very popular with respect to other state agencies. There will be an agreement that's signed, and the agreement will be considered at a commission level, where the person's, an order will go out to the employer and say, X amount of dollar will be taken out of his paycheck to address his child support. The amount that's in arrearages. That type of decision would be a decision that's made by the commission, because it requires an execution of an order to allow for payment to be taken out of his paycheck to address a child support. And I'm just giving you one example of a potential derogatory information.
I'm satisfied. I may have termed it not as derogatory, but, private or confidential, but be that as it may, I understand your.
My concern, my thoughts are that we can, I think the language of the statute is capable of supporting almost any approach that we want to take. And it seems to me that we ought to have at the commission level a volume of routine applications that we can give meaningful review to. I'm concerned about getting a list of 300 people with assertions that we've investigated all these people and they're all qualified and we recommend you issue a license. I don't know what that additional formality brings to the process, and it invites, I think, a level of cavalierness, if that's a word, that's inconsistent with what should go on at our level. I would much prefer to have a system under which denials got a right to appeal to us, and the top supervisors got the right, automatically came to us for approval with some kind of a write-up that we actually took a look at and considered. Personally, I'd feel more comfortable with that kind of a regulatory regime than I would with one that had 200 people or 150 people to approve every couple of weeks. The startup period is going to be different than the flat state, I know, but I just throw that out for consideration.
Are you suggesting that maybe we should have a different standard at the beginning when there's going to be such a high volume?
No, I'm suggesting that that key, not necessarily all key gaming employees, which are defined in the statute as anybody says supervisory authority, and I know we have to refine that more, but that they don't automatically come to us for licensing, that the licensing buck stops with the IEB unless there's a denial. Then everybody gets the right to come to us. But that we define a layer of supervisory authority that's closer to the top, and those people automatically come to us for the final approval, so that we approve the final, give final approval to the people at the top as a routine matter. Maybe it's the top 50 people in a casino, or the top, I don't know, some number. But some number that's manageable, that we can actually do something with, rather than just all be equipped with a rubber stamp.
Yeah, I guess, if the issue is volume, that's gonna change dramatically from the first X period of months to steady state operations. If the issue is what level of responsibility is really worth the commission's review, which I think is the question, then we ought to let the volume sort of go wherever it goes. You know, the question is, what level of supervision really requires us to review? And if it means that for the first 6 months, we're sort of swamped, that's okay, but.
I think that the two are more intertwined than that, because as a practical matter, giving review, a meaningful review at our meetings, bi-weekly meetings, has something to do with the amount of time we have available to look at the packages we're presented and the information we get in those packages. And that is certainly going to be greater at the beginning than it is in a steady state, but it's going to be significant in a steady state. I don't know what the turnover is in these positions, but we could have 50, we meet 26 times a year. We could, if we have anybody who has supervisory authority, we could easily have 50 per meeting, it seems to me, just on a steady state. Pick that number out of the air.
It's 2,500.
In New
Yeah.
Jersey, the keys
With
were
key-
actually broken down into two categories, similar to what you're describing. There was that key qualifier level, which were the real high keys, and then there was another category that we referred to as basic keys, the count room supervisors, the security supervisors, that yes, they are vetted to a higher standard than a gaming employee, but not need to complete a multi-jurisdiction form with a supplemental form. And there was a condensed key application that was greater than a gaming application, but not as great as the key qualifier. So your suggestion has been practiced in New Jersey, where the keys are broken down, and this is something that we can, when we define what are keys, we can break it down into level. There have been other practices in other states.
I would really like to explore that.
I agree with that. I think that's a good suggestion.
It just sounds like we're all in agreement, and it's the point is just who is a key,
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
and how many, and
Right.
what does an org chart
Right.
look like?
right.
So, so you've got a direction. I have two quick, I hope, quick questions. One is, both this question and the one before refer to temporary licenses. We've never discussed temporary licenses. I don't know what they are, but that's another.
It's in the statute, it talks about
Okay.
temporary licenses.
What does it, how does it define them?
I don't know that it defines it. Basically, it,
Well, let me just,
yeah.
we just, obviously, another question is, what is a temporary license? What is sufficient justification for a temporary license? What process awards it? I didn't want to just all of a sudden start talking about temporary licenses without everybody having determined what they are, where they come from, how many there are, what the process is.
My understanding of a temporary license, and because what I read is similar to what New Jersey, during the time of suitability investigation, the gaming establishment will submit a request to the commission saying, this person is urgent to our operation. We need them to commence employment sooner than suitability. In particular with keys, because the suitability investigation for a key may take, in New Jersey was taking, 10 weeks, 12 weeks. So it would allow the casino to demonstrate an urgent need to the commission to issue a temporary license for a period of time to allow for the suitability investigation. to
I
be completed.
understand that, and I'm sure there will be some such situation that we would accept, but I'm just bringing it up as something we're gonna need to define and determine what the process is. I mean, that's the kind of thing where everybody could be temporary, it could become sort of the norm. It happens in the state all the time. So, I'm just raising that as something that is a new term to us that needs to be figured out. Secondly, does the statute call for IEB to be the decision maker on licensing? I'm gathering the way you speak, the answer is yes.
Some licenses. I mean, that's where we're going to need regulations to clarify where are they authorized on behalf of the commission to make those decisions.
Well, we're gonna right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but what strikes me as a little funny, and maybe this is wrong, is that it seemed to me that the licensing department should be the department that makes decisions on whether or not somebody gets a license. The IEB should be what the IEB is to us, which is the finder of fact, and does the investigations, and goes to the licensing department, whose expertise is to say, okay, under these circumstances, you're in or you're out. Does that,
Doesn't make sense to me. Because the investigation is what you're making that judgment, and certainly IEB has a better sense of the investigation and what that means. That's not the way I understand licensing, although there is some clarification on pieces that licensing could do, i.e. fingerprints and assist and do the front-end work for the IEB.
The statute really talks about filing applications with the Bureau and registering with the Bureau. That's what the statute talks about. Now, certainly regulations can be created to create an effect, an interface between the licensing division and the Bureau. And so there's a lot of ways that could be.
right, I mean, we could delegate whatever responsibility. Do you have a sense, I mean, you now know our structure. Does it, in your experience, does it make sense to have IEB be the decision maker on who gets what licenses, or the licensing department make the decisions on who gets what licenses?
Both New Jersey and Ohio, the IAB or the equivalent of the IAB made the decision to recommend or deny based on their findings. The license division was the administrative arm that carried on the process from the point of issuance of a license to creating a credential to ensuring that that credential is issued to the appropriate person.
And that feels right to you?
And that feels right to
Okay.
me. It's worked in other places. I think
Okay.
the IB here would be
Yeah, the difference-
well suited for that role.
Difference being administrative versus investigatory.
Yes.
Well, there's three phases. There's administrative, there's investigatory, and then there's decision-making, but whatever. Okay. So, should we move on to the next one?
The next one is licensing fees, registration fees. I'm recommending that the commission establish a set fee for gaming employee license and registrants. And that key qualifiers have a fee that it is an initial deposit, and you can bill up to a certain amount to cover whatever cost is incurred to complete suitability. That has been practiced in other places. In New Jersey, there was an initial fee of $750, and they could bill a maximum of $4,000. The average cost of a key license in New Jersey was about $2,800. The state of Ohio, there was an application fee of $2,000. At time of licensure, there was another $500, and then there was $46 associated with fingerprints. The end result is that the application fee for a key was pretty much closed. But there were circumstances in New Jersey where the background investigation exceeded the $2,600 that other states established. And this mechanism of establishing a deposit, minimum deposit, and up to a maximum is one that I found to be most efficient, practiced by a number of other states. You will see there's a chart attached to there that lists the different fee structures of some of the states that we were able to verify, and you will see that some of the states have similar things where there is an application fee, and at the end of the day, if the cost exceeded that amount, they will be billed. For gaming employees, an established fee that's incorporates some of the costs associated. In the state of New Jersey, it was $350. That included fingerprinting. In the state of Ohio, it was $250 and a time of application with the $46 fingerprints, and at time of licensure, there was another $250 that was due. That was billed directly to the casinos, and the casinos would pay the commission. And the casinos would work out some type of payment agreement between the employee and the prospective applicant. In New Jersey, the cost was $350, which was a lot less than $500. When the cost to investigate a background for a gaming employee exceeded the $350, the commission was able to bill as administrative costs into the billing of the casinos, and therefore only $350 was recouped from the applicant. In Ohio, there was a straight budget. There was no way to bill back to the company any additional costs. So that's why it was essential for them to establish an initial license fee that was significantly higher than other states. I would say the average is about $300 for a 3-year license fee. I would recommend to be along those lines. With respect to fees, we should also consider what the fee would be like for renewals, because there's another question that we'll be talking about in here that I think goes along with this fee structure stuff, and that is if you establish a fee, because renewals have already been established as 3 years for keys and gaming, that if we establish a fee of $350 to ask the individual to file an application on a timely basis, that there be some carrot. So for example, you're having $350 for 3 years, but if you renew on a timely basis, it's $350 for 4 years, or $300 for 4 years. It encourages the individual to file the application on a timely basis. They do not file the application on a timely basis, then at that point, you revert back to the initial license fee. So there's some incentive there to file the application on a timely basis. And considering fees, I mean, the renewal factor also has to be considered. With respect to registrations, I know the state of Delaware, New Jersey was a little bit different, but the state of Delaware has a fee for 5 years. After the 5 years, they re-register, and there's a fee there. In New Jersey, it was a one-time registration fee. Then they added a caveat that if you were out of the industry for 3 consecutive years, your registration became inactive and you were required to re-register. In talking to Commissioner Wells, I think the 5 years re-registration with a nominal fee would probably work best here. We would at least get the updated information. With respect to registration, we're hoping to incorporate a process that in New Jersey we used to refer to as the flag system. In Ohio, we used to refer to as the rat back system, and that is that we will provide a list to the state police. The state police will monitor this list, and they will notify us when an individual on that list has been arrested. The investigation enforcement unit would then investigate the circumstances around that arrest and bring action if suitability is now in question. There was a fee associated with maintaining that list. by the state police, and in New Jersey, that list became well over 300,000, and the cost became very prohibited, and that's when they put the provision where if you were unemployed out of the industry for a period of 3 years, you're not registered any longer, and you'll be off that list. So keep the cost down by asking that you re-register every 5 years, we can control that as well. Rat back flag system, I don't know what they will call it in Massachusetts, currently doesn't exist. My understanding is that is being looked at in other areas, and hopefully we can be part of that as well. Again, I'm recommending keys be a fee that's minimum deposit up to a certain amount, that the gaming applications be a flat fee, the registrations be a nominal fee. The registrations will be the people who will be working in the hotels, restaurants, etc. Gaming vendors also be a fee similar to keys, where there is a minimum deposit and there is a maximum amount billed, and may also include, depending on the number of qualifiers that that company may have, there may be additional costs per each qualifier because of the extent of the background investigation and the costs associated with that. For vendor registrants, there is a level of business that they must establish before they become suitable for registration, that there will be no fee once they reach a certain level of business, and they now trigger the license fee. Then at that time, there'll be a fee associated with with that application.
Comments?
Well, sounds good to me. I mean, I think that sort of sensitive approach, tailored to the position, sounds like a good approach. And the details, I'd be happy to take your recommendations as to what the fees are and the details.
Same here, sorry for interrupting, but I wonder, it occurs to me that as we invest in a licensing system, if we were to apportion all the costs of licensing, we may not be able to defray all the costs on this particular licensing structure, which is fine. We have the ability to assess our applicants, and we will do that. But I suspect the threshold that you recommend is arrived at trying not to put too much burden on the employees, because ultimately they are the ones who bear that cost. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. That is correct. In particular, for registrants who are people who are probably most in need of finding these jobs, they're the unemployed, the ones who probably will have the most difficulty in paying for a license fee at the very, very beginning. Once they're employed, then obviously, the circumstances may change and they could afford that. But yes, that is the thought process behind this recommendation.
No, I think your recommendations are very sound.
Just to follow up on that, I would hope that we would be at the low end of the cost scale for just that same reason that you're already sensitive to. We don't want this to become a barrier in any way to the audiences that we're most trying to attract or serve.
We touched a little bit about the licensing, registration, and renewals with respect to fees. The commission has already made a decision that the initial license period for keys and gaming is for 3 years. There was no mention, and I haven't read anywhere where there's been a recommendation for a time period for registrants. I'm recommending that the registrant period of time be 5 years, and then they re-register. Respect to keys and gaming employees, that after the initial 3 years, that a year will be added to the renewal, so that the second time, if they renew on a timely basis, will be 4 years versus a 3-year license. And we can leave the license fees the same, but the incentive would be to file early is that extra year of licensure. I think 4-year cycle is sufficient with respect to going back and reviewing suitability. We should be able to keep track of individuals. There is section in the statute that talks about duty to disclose, so it's the individual's responsibility to tell the commission anything that is material during the period of time from the issuance of a license to the time of renewal. If they fail to do that, and we discover that, we can take action for failure to disclose, especially if they've committed an offense that may jeopardize their suitability.
Sounds good.
This is another area where I was hoping, Jill, that you and your people would review this with a really sensitive eye, because, you know, this is a lot of steps, you know, like you gotta go to a computer, and you gotta do a lot of things, and it's the kind of process that some people will have a hard time with. And maybe I'm oversensitive to it, I don't know, but people who are not oversensitive to it, who know about this, I think should review this. So that's one thing. Go ahead.
No, I think you're sensitive to it, and I think that's great. I think there does need to be a discussion about how folks get help maybe filling out, and there are resources, so that can be part of the discussion.
Yeah, no, right. And cures for missing deadlines, there's a whole bunch of stuff. But anybody
Right.
who works with this target audience will read these bullet points and be able to say, is this really problematic or not?
Okay.
The second thing is that you propose the gaming service employee required to undergo a standard background and a Corey check. I guess we haven't decided what the result of the Corey check necessarily means, but this is something we talked about for a year now, that Corey credit and drugs are gonna be a problem for some number of people. And I think we want to think through what level of result under Corey credit and drug are gonna be problematic. So I didn't want this to just go unnoticed, that we've automatically, you know, decided that game and service employees, people who are making beds, are gonna undergo gaming and service employees, like people who are making beds, are gonna have a Corey check. If that automatically implies that something comes up, they're out. So I just think this is a content area, a policy area, and this again involves you, Jill, that we want to talk about really carefully and try to figure out how can we apply thoughtful law enforcement, you know, and thoughtful protection of the public and of the integrity of the facility and so forth, while not compromising our ability to employ target groups.
And all three aren't necessarily on the same level. The credit piece is going to be pervasive and
Right.
part of the community that we want to attract, undoubtedly. And that is conceivably different than Corey or
Right,
drugs.
I agree. I just think all three of those, we really
Right.
need to, so we
Right.
really need to spend some
Disagree.
time to
Right.
hash out what our standards are, and to have the help of people who work with those appropriate demographic groups.
The last piece is a policy question pertaining to suitability, that a person is granted a license just based on suitability, or that it also include an education piece. And I am recommending that while there be strong language to encourage that the casinos hire people who are trained and that they work with the employment training programs, that they work with the community colleges, but the actual verification of education not being included as a piece of licensure. We did that in New Jersey. We had a whole unit that was assigned to do that. It was very labor intensive. It was rather expensive. And I don't know if that's the most efficient way to go about it. There's only one state that I know of at this time that does require licensure to also include education as well as suitability, and that is the state of Pennsylvania. I remember a number of calls while I was still in New Jersey from individuals who worked in New Jersey, were educated in New Jersey, who went to work in Pennsylvania, were having a difficult time obtaining a license because they were unable to verify to Pennsylvania that they did have in fact the educational requirements. There were a number of schools that went out of business. They did not have their certificates. They were unable to get their certificates. The state didn't have the certificates. These individuals had to take courses in Pennsylvania in order to get a license. It became a real hardship for people that really needed to work. I understand the piece of requiring education. I understand the intent of partnering with the colleges, partnering with the employment training. I think this is another area that we could look at when doing the evaluation for licensure as to how these companies are going to be fulfilling that. We can write in the internal controls, stringent procedures to ensure that they do have qualified individuals, and if they don't, they could be subject to penalties and fines without having to require licensure to be suitability and education as well.
So the burden is on the casino and they're hiring folks as opposed to the commission.
Correct.
And then we have the compliance piece, which is if we find out you're not doing it properly, there are fines and whatever else. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
It seems to me that approach flows from a decision that we're going to have primarily casino-based licensing.
Yep.
Because the progression is from the school to the casino to the licensing board, or from the background and experience to the casino to the licensing board. And the market interest in qualified employees is parallels the casino's interest in qualified employees. The casino doesn't want an incompetent blackjack dealer or an incompetent croupier. So it seems to me that makes sense, and it also removes a big chunk of regulatory mechanism that otherwise we'd have to have in place with probably imperfect results. So I think that makes sense.
I agree.
I agree. Okay, that was an easy one.
That concludes
All right,
those 5 questions.
thank you.
That's great. That gets us moving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This old horse is smelling the barn.
Right.
And I want to thank Todd and Karen Wells for helping me walk through all this. It's not easy.
Good team effort. Yeah, thanks.
Item number 9, Director Griffin.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I know I'm between you and the door, but
The barn door?
barn door. But this is an important issue. So Chapter 23K, Section 1-6 states that promoting local small business and the tourism industry including new and existing small business, is fundamental to the policy objectives of this chapter. So I'm here today recommending that Mass Gaming Commissioners define small business. And I'm here asking you to do this or to clarify for a number of reasons. One is that the federal definition of a small business is simply inadequate when you describe the Massachusetts economy. The federal definition has a threshold of 500 employees or a revenue size of up to 35.5 million, depending on the NAICS code or the type of business. So in Massachusetts, according to that definition, and this is according to Bob Nelson, the Massachusetts District Director of the SBA, according to that definition, 98% of businesses in Massachusetts would be considered a small business. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce census that was done in 2008, the latest census, 85.5% of the businesses in Massachusetts have 20 or fewer employees. Only 7 or 8% have more than 100. Outside of Greater Boston, approximately 95% of the firms have fewer than 10 employees. So, if you're looking at the western part of the state, this is really a concern. After our vendor advisory task force, members suggested that we issue a clarification to applicants. The other reason, in addition to the inadequate federal definition, there's a real difference between a business, and I'm sure you know this, but with multi-million-dollar operation and hundreds of employees, and a really small business. They have different perspectives, radically different needs. For example, access to capital, the day-to-day operations, and an applicant or a licensee may want to radically change their procurement policies or other thought processes if they were targeting a much smaller business in a vendor or supplier capacity. So some of the things we've looked at are existing definitions of small business in the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth has a couple of definitions that are related to a specific program. For example, the Mass Growth Capital Corporation adheres to the federal definition of a small business, whereas and I think I attached the small business purchasing program, which adheres to a much smaller definition, which is 50 full-time workers or less than 15 million average gross annual revenues over a 3-year period. And these are businesses based in Massachusetts, in business for at least 1 year. The other definition, which is similar, a similar threshold, is the Mass Group Health Insurance definition of a small business, which also looks at up to 50 employees. So So I guess what I'm suggesting is that we issue a clarification of what is a small business, or what are the targeted sizes of small businesses that we would like applicants to think about. And I'll just add, we've had discussions with Bill Vernon from the National Federation of Independent Businesses, with Andre Porter from the Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurship, with Chris Guerin from Associated Industries of Massachusetts. All agree that the federal definition doesn't seem to serve our purpose. So I think there are two choices. We can adopt an existing definition, say the one that the Small Business Purchasing Program uses of 50 employees, or we could land somewhere in the middle. Andre Porter suggests that perhaps 100 employees wouldn't rule folks out, but it would at least target it a little bit more. So,
Director, are we in, I mean, is there a formula? I understand the federal model doesn't work for us, but just creating our own, are we in any jeopardy? Or how did you come about that? What standards did you use? Does it make more sense to use one that's already in existence for that reason? If it fits our needs, obviously.
I think it makes sense to adopt a program that is in existence, like the one I included in your packet.
Do we have an idea? We have certain kinds of businesses that are logically going to interact with the casinos, right? We have linen suppliers, we have food suppliers, we have restaurants, we have others who we can see. And then during the construction phase, we can identify a whole bunch of others that are going to interact. Do we have any idea of what the impact of one or more of these definitions would have on that target group? I was thinking, as you were talking about restaurants, we're trying to ensure that the casinos interact with restaurants. Certainly the corner restaurant employs less than 50 people, so it'd be a small business. Does the higher end restaurant that you'd also want to be part of this employ more than 50?
Yeah.
Or how
Usually the definition focuses on full-time permanent employees.
Right.
And so, I wouldn't think it would have a huge impact on the restaurant industry. And I think the local neighborhood restaurants and some of the local businesses that we are trying to grow
Right.
would potentially have a positive benefit.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. It's not so much the benefit of the,
Yeah.
it's who are we potentially excluding? That's what I just was
Well,
wondering.
I guess we're not trying to exclude anyone. What we're, I think, trying to get applicants to think about is, I think that very large businesses don't, have no problem doing
Right.
business with larger businesses.
Right.
What we're trying to maybe get them to think about is, how do you work with a local business that has maybe, smaller capacity?
Right.
Do you split contracts? Do you, that sort of thing?
Right.
And I'd invite Commissioner Stebbins to join in since we've been discussing this.
Yeah. Do you have something you want to?
Well, I did. Perhaps we should also, I think the definition of small business is important, and I think, we should continue exploring that. I also would point to some of the approach that the Operational Services Division has taken, and also the Supplier Diversity Office, which is to recognize that you may be contracting with a large business, but that business itself may have a larger or smaller participation of small business. And that should be accounted for, because even though an initial purchase order may be only fulfilled by a large conglomerate, they themselves have a lot of activity, some of which could be local and some of which could be small business as well. Now,
Absolutely.
This takes me back to a previous point relative to measuring. How do we keep track of these? But I would sort of leave it at that. We wouldn't want, the second subcontractor to measure where they buy from necessarily, but I think the first relationship, the sub of that first supplier, is an important thing to consider.
Absolutely, I would agree, and definitely something we need to figure out how to measure.
Yeah, I would just comment and say, we had this discussion a long time ago when we were going through an initial set of policy questions, and I think we all remarked, as we have today, that 500 employees just seem ludicrous as a definer in Massachusetts as a small business. Certainly, healthcare legislation, other programs come along and maybe give us a better definition. I was looking at the small business purchasing program sheet, and not only does it delineate a small business as 50 or fewer full-time equivalents, but an interesting piece has its principal place of business in Massachusetts. The notion of an applicant telling us they're working with small business, a small business like Microsoft, but who only has 40 employees in Massachusetts, I think would be a little disingenuous. I would like to suggest, again, I'm not feeling that we're under a serious timeline to get this issue addressed. Maybe, floating the question out on our comments line as to, should a small business in Massachusetts be defined as 50 or 100? And certainly I like the definition, or adding to the definition, of having its principal place of business in Massachusetts. Put it out there for a week or so and see what kind of comments and feedback we get, so we don't, inadvertently X somebody out or put somebody at a disadvantage. I mean, we've had some comments from people that, are part of our stakeholder group that have asked for changes in the definition or define it a little bit better. But, if we have some time, we should put it out and see what kind of comment and feedback we get.
Your comments led me to a second thought, and that is, what are the consequences of our definition? I mean, apart from their practical impact on employers, the consequences begin to appear as we evaluate the applications, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of the applications are going to be here tomorrow.
Right.
So it's too late to affect probably the content of those. But that does mean that we ought to deal with this quickly, right? And what are the other, so we've got questions in the application that talk about how we're going to deal with small businesses, and that would be affected by this definition. What other regulatory impacts would this definition have?
I don't know if this is regulatory. Many of the host community agreements, the applicants have specified that they will
I see.
Work with the local communities
Okay.
and hire local vendors and small businesses.
Okay. So it'd have an impact on the host community agreements and the target groups to satisfy the obligations under those agreements. Yeah.
And the legislation doesn't set out any goals, right? It set out,
No, it doesn't.
it speaks to promote these
Right.
kinds of, right,
Right.
but it leaves open any specifics. Yeah. I'm certainly comfortable with Commissioner Stebbins' idea of putting this out. Have you run the proposal of using the small business purchasing program by that advisory group?
Not by the entire advisory group. We've reached out to a handful of members.
Okay, well, those people by definition would be as good a group as any to review this. So
Yeah,
I
we
would
should-
say, send it out to the whole group. But I think inviting broader comment is fine. I also agree that time is pretty short, because if the category 1 folks are gonna have a chance to speak to it, it's gonna have to happen, fairly soon. But in general, I think the small business program is fine. I mean, it's arbitrary. 50 as opposed to 45 or 65 is kind of irrelevant, but these are common sense numbers, and it's been practiced and it's tried and true for the state. So I think sort of having a presumption that this is the way we want to go, run it by our expert advisory board and invite outside comment and give it a week or so and see what we come up with, but with a presumption that this idea is good.
I just think having to Jill's efforts, having a conversation about this, because I think people are more mindful of the SBA definition, which, again, 500 as a small employer in Massachusetts is somewhat laughable. Looking at the optics of it all, of an applicant saying, I'm supporting small business, and, I'm contracting with people who are at 500, I think, the reaction of the general population would be that's not a small business. So I think kind of drawing a delineation, or at least some type of editorializing, that the SBA definition kind of goes out the window here in Massachusetts, and that there's some reasonable alternatives that have been produced to the public sector, I think will balance the equation in the conversation and the results a little bit better.
Good. I
Great,
agree.
thank you.
So we got a plan. Do we have anything else?
How could we?
Do we have a motion?
I move that we adjourn.
Second. In favor? Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous.